I homeschool our youngest as an act of resistance against white supremacy. I'm also a wife, and I live in Houston, Texas. But professionally, I am a nationally recognized equity trainer. I teach educators in anti-bias, anti-racist education. Basically, I go across the country to different schools. It can be public, private, charter schools. And we discuss what is anti-bias education, what is anti-racism. We go through the framework. We investigate the ways in which bias and racism does in fact exist in their teaching practice. And then together we analyze what are the roots of that, and then we create an action plan so that we can actually create inclusive classrooms for our learners. Let's see, I'm trying to think. I got into ABAR work professionally in about 2016, 2017. I went to my first training through Crossroads, which is out of the Midwest. I then was facilitating with Embracing Equity, and that's an organization I always encourage people to check out, Embracing Equity, if you're beginning in the journey. And then I also am committed to overcoming racism. Anytime they come to Houston and they host a workshop, I attend at least once a year one of their workshops. And then I'm also in community with Montessori for social justice, and I work in partnership. I call myself a super volunteer. If they say they need me to do something, I do my best to make that happen. So I have a lot of roles, and so I've been doing this now for a few years.
Yeah, so Britt, you said something right off the top that I'd like for you to expound upon, if that's okay. You mentioned being a mom and that you are homeschooling one of your sons. Could you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think that that's one of the reasons why I so quickly fell in love with you as I followed you on social media platforms.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm a former classroom teacher. I've taught in public Montessori in Illinois and here in Texas. And both of my children were in public schools that I taught at. And, you know, as I'm going through this journey that I think a lot of people are going through right now, they're waking up, they're realizing, oh my gosh, my curriculum is whitewashed. We're not teaching accurate truths. There is deep segregation that's happening within the schools, either because there's a gifted program, so a school within a school. It could be because we have a dual language program, some type of bilingual program, and you see school segregation that's happening. But you just start to see all of these inequities. And so as I'm reading about it and I'm looking at my own two children, I'm saying, this is what is happening to them. The straw that broke the camel's back with our youngest is when a teacher had told him to shut up during nap time. And at that point, I knew that anti-Blackness was so thick inside the classroom and inside the school. My partner said, why don't we homeschool? And so as a teacher, that was hard. It was hard because, you know, you don't want to give up on your own students and you don't want to give up on teaching. But it was probably the most radical decision I made as a parent, to say that I want my child to be affirmed in his many identities. I've homeschooled both of them, and our oldest went to 7th grade this year. It was his choice. He said he wants to be around his friends, and he's 13, of course. So we said okay, and he went back. But to say that I want my child to be affirmed in all of their many identities, to say I want my child to be able to embrace differences, have accurate language, to know how to advocate for himself and for his friends, and to know that the school is not providing that is heartbreaking. And it's really what spurred us to then homeschool.
And I know that you refer to your sons in a very cool way. Would you mind sharing that? Because it's one of the things that I love.
Yeah, so we call them artists.
How did that come about? Like, why artist?
That came about when our children were young, and we really wanted to have, we wanted to be open to gender diversity in our home. And we wanted them to be able to self-identify, how do they view themselves? And so by always calling them boys or sons was really putting this overemphasis on an identity that didn't need to be emphasized in that way. And so for us, you know, we want our children to know that they're creative, that they're craftsmen, that they are, you know, we're Christian. And so we, you know, we're made in God's image, and God is a creator, then you therefore are also creatives. And so that's how we landed on artists.
I love it. I love it. So, Britt, you know that I primarily serve in dual language programs around the country, and the resource that I have on the screen is what guides our work. It also delineates our three goals, the three goals that really should be the foundation of any dual language program. And it's really interesting because one of the things that I've noticed as I serve dual language programs here in the US, but also abroad, is that the first two goals, which are bilingualism and biliteracy and grade level academic achievement in two program languages, like those definitely make sense with us and our community because many of us really experience that linguistic oppression. But the third goal, Britt, is the one that I feel like really, as one of the co-authors of that resource, like that really is the foundation of it all. Because what good is it if kids are bilingual and biliterate if they don't know how to see others fully and be able to connect and collaborate with others and to know that they're a part of an oppressive system and that they have to dismantle that system. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit or ask you to talk about why this work and what kinds of difficulties and obstacles do you encounter as you engage in anti-bias, anti-racism work in schools all over the United States?
So I'll be honest, I fell into this work. I fell into consulting. And I don't think that there's anyone that holds such a marginalized identity that necessarily chooses to be an ABAR educator. There's this level of like you're expected to do this work. And then at the same time, I really believe that racism and bias is learned. And so if I really, really believe that it's learned, then I have to also equally believe that it can be unlearned if there's going to be people that are going to help us to unlearn it. And so I fell into consulting with this notion of how can I continue my gift of teaching, right? How can I continue to give that away? And how can I make really deep, meaningful impact in ways that will progress all of us forward? And so for me, anti-bias, anti-racist work is just a fundamentally getting back to the roots of humanizing one another. It is getting back to love. It's getting back to justice principles. And you know, what I think it's important for folks to understand about me is I went to public school my whole life, like just into traditional public school, nothing special. And so I was socialized in that same whitewashed curriculum. I saw what school segregation looked like. I saw zero tolerance policies being enacted on my peers. Like I saw all of the inequities that were happening and I socialized it and I drew inaccurate conclusions because I didn't have an adult in my life to help me think about it. I didn't have an adult in my life to give me language or context. And so fast forward, I became a teacher. I absolutely perpetuated characteristics of white savior complex and paternalism. And I know what's better for you and for your community. And then I had a waking up moment. And that's important for me to note because there's so many Black women and people of the global majority that have left breadcrumbs all along the way to get me to a place that I could liberate myself, I could free myself, I could create a classroom that was truly inclusive for my learners, where they could feel seen and heard and valued in that way. And so I want to also leave breadcrumbs for the next person that's saying, I'm committed to the work as well.
Yeah. If I may share, Britt, like one of the things that's been hardest for me, because like this is what I live and breathe, has been to notice and hear the reactions of some educators, especially at this crucial time in our history, not embracing the Black Lives Matter movement. And I mean, I'm getting a little bit emotional because to me, it's so clear, but I have to understand and acknowledge that perhaps that doesn't come to everyone. And so one of the things that I really would like for you to share with us is when an educator specifically retorts that all lives matter, like what is the difference for those of us that may need clarification in terms of All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. If you could kind of shine a light on that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 2016, I wore my first Black Lives Matter t-shirt into the classroom. And at the time I was teaching 4th and 6th grade. And I remember being really, really nervous. And I told the art teacher, my dear friend Ruth, white woman, I go into her room, I'm like, I'm kind of nervous. What if someone comes and they say, you know, I have an issue with your shirt. What if they report me for being, I don't know, political or all lives matter? I remember Ruth just being like, you know, I would just point to it and say, which word exactly do you have an issue with? Because if it's the word Black, then that's really a you issue. And that somehow just really showed me how when we center Black folks in that way, especially when you've not been used to centering Black people, you're so used to using Black people as a tool and discarding Black people, that when you center that, people then will retort with all lives matter. And simply, you know, you just have to say that historically all lives haven't mattered and all lives haven't been equal. Even obviously now, today, it could be here in the United States, but across the world, there are communities that are being persecuted and treated unfairly and killed at a higher rate than other communities. And saying that all lives matter not only ignores the fact, but you're trying to deflect the responsibility and the accountability of how can we right a wrong. And so to have the privilege to be able to say that all lives matter and say that I'm disregarding any type of data. You know, I oftentimes will ask folks that I work with, I'll say, well, can you show me an institution, an educational institution? Can you show me the data in which the students' data shows me that all students do matter? Can you show me an institution that is non-racist, where everyone has the same academic outcome? And you can't. So even in the data, we can say, gosh, everyone here is not being served, and which means all the students are not reaching their fullest potential. So whether the term Black Lives Matter phrase is jarring, if it is jarring to you, then it should be. It should be a reckoning of saying, why do folks feel the need they have to say Black Lives Matter? Why do they feel they have to yell it or write it or demand it? But then more importantly, we have to ask ourselves, what would society look like if Black lives really did matter?
Yeah. One of the things that has bubbled up in my conversations as I serve dual language educators is that often many of us are people of color serving in dual language. And so for those of us that facilitate instruction in Spanish, for example, we'll somehow feel exempt from the fact that we too can be oppressive. And so there's this ideology even within Latino culture in terms of colorism and classism. And so even within folks that are Black, Indigenous people of color, that can also exist. Might you be able to touch upon that as well? Because often as educators of color, we think that we are a part of the solution without really thinking and digging deeply into our own actions.
Could you tell me a little bit more? Because I think I know where you're going with this. Is it in the sense of, because I hold a racialized identity or because I hold a cultural identity, then therefore I must not uphold these very oppressive qualities? Is that?
Yeah, so I'll be super clear because, you know, I like to cause desmadre, chaos. A lot of us grew up with pretty families that really were pretty subtractive in terms of Blackness, and so we would say things or hear things in the home, in our Spanish-speaking homes that really were pretty horrific. And so I think that one of the things that I've noticed, not just with Latino teachers, but also with Black teachers, teachers of Asian descent, just teachers of color in general, sometimes we don't realize that we too have become colonized and are colonizing others. And so I have one example. I have a teacher that I remember quite vividly about 3 years ago. Spanish speaking, Mexican descent, said to me, I just can't teach Black kids. Because in dual language programs, specifically two-way programs, we have about 50% of the kids that feel most comfortable in mobilizing English, and about 50% of the kids that feel most comfortable mobilizing the partner language. And I remember that just absolutely shocked me, but not so much because it was happening in my own family as well. Does that make sense? That even as a person of color, sometimes we hold those ideologies and we too begin to oppress our students.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to how, as teachers, we try to be so careful about what we say to students. And as teachers, it's why we do so much praising, which is a whole nother Montessori story about we don't praise in Montessori. But anyways, we do so much praising because we know how that really builds up a learner, right? But if you have someone that's constantly giving you negative information, we know that someone will internalize it and then they will believe what has been told to them, right? And so it's the same thing. If you've been socialized in your family or in community or in society, that in fact, that Blackness is somehow subhuman or less than, then you're going to do everything in your power to try to make sure to set yourself apart. And there's this age-old saying that will say, well, at least I'm not Black, right? And you see it in a lot of myself. My racialized identity is Black, but my ethnicity is Black biracial. So my mom is white, my dad is Black, but I identify as a Black woman, and that's the way I walk through the world. And people will really try to make me more like ambiguous, or they'll say like, "Gosh, you're so beautiful. Are you Puerto Rican?" Like they are trying to make me everything but Black. I'm like, no, I'm Black, and they're like, but like, what else are you? And so that there's like this really deep-seated anti-Blackness that's in our community. And then I think particularly within the Latinx, Latino, Hispanic community, it's interesting, studying the transatlantic slave trade and knowing that the United States, I think we were the fifth country to receive the most enslaved Africans, but South America and the Caribbeans received more enslaved Africans than in the United States. And so knowing that there's this history of enslaved Africans being stolen and kidnapped and bought and sold in those countries, but yet trying to distance themselves from that history of slavery and really try to take on that identity of the colonizer. And it's also a way of protecting yourself, right? Because you see how, going back to that Black Lives Matter statement, you see how society really does treat Black people. And you're trying your hardest to be like, that's not me, so don't treat me that way. So it's almost like this cognitive dissonance where we want to say all lives matter on one end, and yet you're doing everything you can to perform whiteness in the way you speak, in your clothing, in your language, in your culture, and all these ways we try to uphold and perform whiteness as an act of protection. And
Yeah.
we just know that it doesn't protect anyone, it just alienates you from your own community.
Absolutely. I mean, that's been really tough to have and engage in those conversations with my Latinx, Latino community in terms of what can we do to support Black Lives Matter in this moment. You and I have seen on social media that there's also a lot of performative acts. And so I think that one of the things that's important to remember is that we have to first acknowledge that schools were in fact created and established to promote that white, monocultural, monolingual, patriarchal, heteronormative way of living and breathing. And if we don't, as educators, acknowledge that, then that becomes that first huge obstacle, don't you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask you because one of the things that I love that you've been doing on social media, now you can say in Spanish, but you can say, yo causo desmadre, ¿verdad? Like you're a guerrillera, you're a warrior. One of the things that I love that you've created a visual for is that pyramid of accountability. I mean, all of us, I think, come with good intentions as teachers, but for me, your work on that, like as I was reading the examples of this pyramid of accountability, I was like, damn. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So like I said, I mean, I'm still waking up. you know, I'm still learning. And in my like first year, 2 years, when I was like going deep into ABAR work and I was learning and unlearning, you know, I took a note because I wanted to say, kind of going back to that pyramid of accountability. You know, it's when we think about school and how the institution of education was created here in the United States and who it was created for. It was not created for us or for our children. But then like now today, how the history is whitewashed. Like I think about, I had to go back, I had to relearn the story of Brown versus Board of Education on my own, right? Because again, we do a disservice to children of color. And I had to learn on my own that the story of Brown versus Board of Education didn't begin with Black and African-American families, but it really began with Mexican-American families. And that's something I was like, okay, I'm a teacher and I don't even know this. You know, I didn't know about, let's see if I pronounce it right, Salvaterra. Did I say that?
That was pretty good, yeah.
Okay, Salvaterra versus Independent School District in Del Rio, Texas in 1930. So this is 25 years before. I had to learn about Roberto Alvarez versus the Board of Trustees in Lemon Grove School District. I had to learn about, let's see, that now the landmark case, Sylvia Mendez versus Westminster. Like all of these cases were before. And so that's how come it's important for that pyramid of accountability of like, when you're going and you're studying these things, you have to stop at that active ally, pause, and then reflect in on your own and say, what are the roots of how come I didn't know this? Like where in my lineage at this point from 0 to now, who are all of the co-conspirators who held this information from me, right? And I could go back from my 4th grade teacher, my 5th grade teacher, my 6th grade. So if everyone told me about Brown versus Board of Education, starting with Linda Brown, but they didn't tell me about how Mexican Americans worked in solidarity and were the beginning, those were co-conspirators, right? So I don't want to repeat that. So I got to reflect in. I'm going to do more studying and more learning. Now what I'm going to do is then I'm going to start to change my curriculum. I'm going to start adding in voices. And then I'm going to ask myself, well, gosh, who else? Like if I didn't know that Mexican Americans were a part of the school desegregation and then thus integration, I wonder if Asian Americans had to do with this. So I got to go down a rabbit hole there. Then you can move to that next one as an accomplice. And now you can start to say, you can go out to your coworkers and say, hey, this is the information that I've learned. You can then be vigilant and become a co-conspirator, and you can actually write your state board of education, the people who draft your standards and curriculum, and say, I want to see this a part of a state mandated standard that we're going to teach this accurate history, this truthful history. And so then you start to see yourself move up. When you start as an active ally, you go in first. Then you go into the people you're in community with, and then you create policies. And that's what anti-racism is all about. Anti-racism is all about how can we create outcomes that focus on institutional and systemic change. That's how come we don't, in anti-racism education, we don't focus on implicit bias, because the research will tell us implicit bias training doesn't do anything. It does not move the needle at all. It's also why you see really large corporations like Starbucks who are like, oh, we're gonna do a day-long implicit bias training. And folks like me are like, but it won't move the needle. But there's some institutional policies that can move the needle and can actually make some change. So that was just a big learning thing, because whiteness is our dominant culture here in the United States. And the root of whiteness is performative. Like everything about whiteness is performative. Then your ally work turns performative.
Clarify that for us, just for those of us that perhaps in this space have never heard that before, because that's powerful, what you just mentioned, that last piece. White is performative. What do you mean by that? Because I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of dual language, but I'd love for you to just illuminate us.
Yes, because the history of the white racialized identity here in the United States is all about power, domination, and colonization, then that means that there's actually no undercurrent of a culture there, right? Like language, music, food, the concept of time, the way that you might honor or respect or see life and death and marriage and ceremony. That is not a part of the white racialized history. So what happens then when, in order for someone to dominate, to colonize, to come in, you might think of like, if anyone ever had a really dominating administrator, right? Who's not at all about building relationships, but can come in and they wear the suit and they talk the talk and they're having like everybody else do the work for them. And that is just a performance. But we know, like, you know, after people have left the meeting, after the door is shut, like we all know what is happening here. So then what means that happens is like when we start to engage, it can be in the LGBTQ, disabled, it could be in your anti-racist work, that we can then do the same things. We try to, we almost like put it on, right? Like we put on the t-shirt with the slogan that says, you know, Black Lives Matter. We might do the Blackout Tuesday. So like we're performing it. It's a show. We're the sage on the stage instead of being the guide on the side next to it actually doing the work.
Britt, I'm going to ask you to pause just a second. If you could all mute yourself. Those of you that are just coming in, I did click on that, but we're hearing a little bit of feedback. Thank you so much, Britt. Like that totally helps so much. As an FYI, one of the things that we are working on in dual language, because obviously this oppression also happens with people of color in terms of language. And so for us, it's very easy to make those connections in terms of linguistic oppression and the fact that so many of us have lost our mother tongue because we had to quickly Americanize. One of the things that was interesting for us in dual language is that we've been lesson planning through a monolingual and a monocultural patriarchal heteronormative way forever and ever, because so much of the instruction obviously focuses on this standard English, this literacy that has been described as so narrow. That's what we've been given. And so for the first time, we have a lesson framework that really allows us to lesson plan through an equity and social justice lens. And we look at 4 ways to really focus on that sociocultural competence, critical consciousness. And the first and most important one is that we lesson plan in order to amplify the voices of communities who have been marginalized as part of the oppressive system here in the United States. And that has never happened. But that's difficult to do when you've never been exposed to that. And so it's imperative, you know, that all of us begin the work because it just isn't happening. As an FYI, the second way is to allow students to connect to self and connect to community. The third one is to use their linguistic repertoire to make cross-linguistic connections and embrace translanguaging spaces where our children and where we are not punished for leveraging all that we bring into this space. And then finally, getting rid of this idea of academic and social language, because all language has value and our job is not to disrupt or destroy what kids bring into the space. It's to maintain and expand. And so I know that you have some books and resources that are going to be really helpful to the teachers in this space because many of us are just starting this journey. Would you mind sharing some of those resources? If I'm a teacher here, one of the 700 teachers here, like what can I do to get started on this journey?
I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. If you're probably like, what in the world is she doing? But the book might be downstairs. But I was just gonna say, so I have a minor in ESL, and I remember, and all of my professors, by the way, were white. And it was interesting because there was this heavy emphasis on playground language versus academic language. I just wanted to, because you brought it back. And they used to say, you know, because teachers would say, well, I have a question. What if a student starts speaking Spanish like during science, and like how do we respond to that? And this is uber problematic, so I'm not advocating for this. And I just remember my professors being like, oh, will you just remind them that they can do that at the playground, but they cannot speak like that during science. And I mean, just like how deeply embedded you are to anti-Spanish or anti like whatever the language is, and how much you uphold English. And it's not any kind of English, because we even see with our Black students, there's Black students that will speak in African American vernacular English. And that even is treated in the same way, right? Like it's not, because it's not standard English, just ridiculed. And I remember like even myself, like doing DOL and coming in elementary school, and there's daily oral language, and so the sentence is incorrect. And it oftentimes is the way in which I speak, it is the way in which my family speaks, would be in like African American vernacular English on the board. And to have the class to go up there and correct the way we speak with the red marker, and how absolutely devastating that is on our identity. And to know that, when instead we can make it about, there's different ways in which people execute English. And as long as the other person, you are coming to a common understanding, communicating is communicating, right? And getting back to that power balance.
Absolutely. And people keep asking, I'm looking at the notes here at the comments, people are asking about the lesson planning framework. So for those of you that have not been with us in terms of this new work, it's the C6 Biliteracy Framework. And the C6 Biliteracy Framework was conceptualized specifically to align with the 3 goals of dual language. And so for the first time, we're not using a framework to lesson plan that was about transitioning kids to English. And all of these intersections are anti-bias, anti-racism work, because they are grounded in this ideology that somehow our kids that are of color, our Black, Indigenous students, don't bring whatever it is that we need to bring to the space, which means that we don't fall into that white monolingual monocultural lens. And so I will include some resources, because there are videos that have been created. If you follow me on social media, you also have access to all of that. So make sure that you do that. What about 1 or 2 books, Britt? Because I also, I don't know if y'all know this, but I was watching Miss Britt Hawthorne having a conversation with movie star Drew Barrymore this week. I was like, yeah, no manches, Britt. No manches, Britt means no manches, ¿verdad? Tell us. I saw you sharing some of those books, and I was like, oh, yes. He needs to share.
Okay, so well, for educators, I have some books that are a little bit different, but I'm super excited to share. I love sharing books. The first book I'm going to share is actually called Beyond Heroes and Holidays. This one is, you can only, I think, only order the book from Teaching for Change, but Beyond Heroes and Holidays is a great book. Particularly, there's an article, it's a collection of essays and articles from, again, the people who I've said who have left us breadcrumbs. So Sonia Nieto, she is one of the founding mothers of culturally relevant pedagogy and anti-bias, anti-racist work. She has an article in here called Affirmation, Solidarity, and Critique, Moving Beyond Tolerance in Education. And she talks about the 5 levels of multicultural education, starting with that monocultural, moving all the way to affirmation, solidarity, and critique. So that's this whole book is wonderful, but that's a good one. Okay, another book, has anyone in the chat box, has anyone read this book or have this book?
I know that,
yes.
Yes, I see yes, and I know that a lot of us are familiar with Nieto's work. And I love that you're sharing that, Britt, because one of the things that has happened in dual language is that when we talk about that 3rd goal, people will say, well, we are working on it. We have a multicultural night, or we have an event for Black history. And what they don't realize is that really those events, those community building events, are for the white folks in the space, not really amplifying the voices of the Black, Indigenous folks in the space. And so that too is performative.
It's so performative. And actually she has that listed under acceptance. So you still have to move to respect, and then go to affirmation, solidarity, and critique. And so that's what, like, that's that kind of moving beyond the holidays, and it actually being a value, right? Like, we know that when you're in that affirmation, critique, and solidarity phase is when it no longer has to be named. And that's where whiteness is right now in our schools, where whiteness doesn't have to be named. And actually, when you call something out as Eurocentric or white, people then are like, no, it's not, because it's so normalized. It's neutral, and it is what the standard is. And so what we're saying in anti-racism is that we want that for actually every single culture. We want every single culture to be so normalized and valued in that way. So this is a good one. And then there's actually another article in here by Louise Thurman Sparks called Tolerance versus Transformation. And she gives some really practical tips. Okay, my next one, because we talked about Black Lives Matter, there's a book by Rethinking Schools called Teaching for Black Lives. Y'all get it. And if you want, it expired on the 11th. So Rethinking Schools just did a 40% discount for this book, but you know what? If you hit me up, I might be able to ask Rethinking Schools to extend it for us. But they have this book, Teaching for Black Lives. Again, it's a collection of classroom teachers who've been doing this work since 2015, 16, 17, somewhere in there. And they talk about it institutionally, systemically, and they get it into nitty gritty. Rethinking Schools also has another book, but y'all probably already know this one.
Ay, claro, it's a good one.
Yes, Rethinking Bilingual Education, Welcoming Home Languages in Our Classrooms. So this one probably, if you've already are following Dr. Jose, this one probably would be helpful, but not necessarily foundational. I would say if you're new here, grab this book. Because what's really important is it's going to talk about the history of bilingual education. And when we used to have bilingual education here in the United States, and it was very normalized, and we had bilingual schools in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, but they were particularly for French and Dutch and German. And then when the shift became having bilingual schools with the language Spanish, how then that became a problem. So it gives you just a lot of, like, when people start to push back and like, do we really need dual language? You're like, oh, let's talk about the history here. Absolutely. Okay, I have another one. Is that okay? Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? This one is a foundational text for all educators. I see Alexis already said yes. Dr. Beverly Tatum, the book came out in the 90s. I have the original, if I can grab it, copy here. And so you can see, I want y'all to see the updates, maybe this way. You can see how much thicker this one is because she has included in this new update. Because I'll tell you if I was like, y'all just get the older one. This newer one has chapters for biracial, multiracial, and also has chapters for MENA, which is Middle Eastern North African identity development, which hopefully we will get on the census. We didn't get it on the census this time, but hopefully next time. But it walks you through the identity development of children. I was just on a call actually with Drew Barrymore.
Mira, name dropper, la miran.
Yes, and after the call, after like the live went off, we were talking about how in middle school students will self-segregate, and Drew Barrymore and Dr. Aliza were talking about it, and I said, well, actually there's this great book, and she talks about it being affinity spaces. And Dr. Aliza was saying, well, do you think we should do those mix it up at lunch activities where you get people and they mix it up and people sit by birth dates? And I was like, elementary, you could do that, but see, you have to be rooted in research. In elementary, yes, totally do that. But come adolescence, when they're going through an identity development, oftentimes they're going into that internalization stage, but they're also doing it as an act of protection because they're experiencing so many microaggressions that they can then be in a community where they don't have to translate, they don't have to transcribe, they don't have to explain, they don't have to try to water something down or laugh at a part of their culture because the dominant group might laugh at it. And when we do those mix-it-up days, like in adolescence and middle school or high school, we're essentially asking the students that are getting bullied to sit with their bully, right? And when we think about it like that, we're like, gosh, that wasn't my intention, but that becomes your impact. So there's other things that we can do if we're trying to actually create not a safe space, but if we're actually trying to create a brave space in our classrooms and in our schools.
I love that because that whole idea of safe space and the whole idea of teaching tolerance, like that's not what we're seeking. What we're seeking is for every child to just be valued as they are, and
Yes.
to see them as an asset, coming full of assets. Britt, one of the questions that came up was in terms of African American English, and
Mm-hmm.
how as a teacher might I be able to address some of the concerns that come about when the schooling system that I serve in is asking me to assess
Mm-hmm.
and not value that student's language, which is a part of that student's one linguistic repertoire, and who is mobilizing and leveraging all that he, she, or they bring into the space.
Yes. So I will dig deep into my Instagram archives. And today, hopefully, if you get a chance, I will reshare. I think it was from 2018. I did a long story of African American Vernacular English, or also known as ABAR. But also Linda, I think it's Linda Christensen, in Teaching Beyond Holidays and Heroes, has a good article in this book too. But number one, what's really, really important is that you acknowledge, in fact, that it is a language, and you acknowledge the history of the language, of it being a pidgin language, from where you had, again, enslaved Africans that were being stolen and kidnapped from several different communities and countries in Africa and brought here. And so you had enslaved Africans who were unable to communicate with one another because they didn't have the same home language. And then when they came here, it became a mix of English and their native language together. So we acknowledge that it's a language, and we affirm the learner, like, oh, in fact, do you speak in Abe? And the learner's like, what? So we acknowledge it's a language. We also acknowledge that standard English is a language, and we call it standard English. We don't call it the English. It's not the English. It's not the right English. And so we then also give them opportunities to write in both. Journal reflections, if you do journal reflections in your classroom, if they're taking notes, please remember you can write in your home language, and we identify that as such. You can also create, there's a teacher in Atlanta, Georgia, Ashley, and she had her middle schoolers create an Ave dictionary. And she said they felt so affirmed and good, and they were creating like parts of speech and the history of the words. So there's so many ways in which you can affirm a child's home language and acknowledge and recognize, okay, in this writing, the expectation is for standard English.
Yeah,
Are we all on board on that?
I love that. So the question is, AVE, the acronym is AAVE.
VE. Yep.
And then for those of you that are also talking about, yes, this is translanguaging. Remember that in our work, translanguaging is about having one linguistic repertoire, and there's no hierarchy between academic and social language. And so when one of our students says the word troca or pos, we don't destroy it. We maintain, sustain, and expand the student's linguistic repertoire. And that's been really tough for us, Britt. Like, some of us are really into this whole ideology, including myself. I have a lot of growing to do with this idea of proper Spanish, or not having our Spanish be enough. That is a conversation that happens in dual language a lot. We have time for a couple more questions, Britt. Would you be up for that?
I would be.
So one of the participants was asking a question about math. I don't know if you might have any information about math, but they were asking, how do we bring equity into the math classroom?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so number one person to follow, if you don't already follow him, and it's another Jose, but Jose Bilson. He is one of the founders of EduColor. He's really active on Twitter, not so much on Instagram, but he's a math teacher, and he's also an equity trainer as well out of New York. So follow him. He is doing incredible work. There's another website. Let me find it here.
As you look for that, Britt, let me know when you're ready. I'm going to read another question. Somebody was asking about our thoughts on having a fourth goal. So look, I know this conversation has been happening, and look, as one of the co-authors, I'm all for adding another goal, but I do want you to know that sociocultural competence is really that entry point, and you can dismantle systems of oppression if we actually go beyond the performance level that Britt and I were talking about. And so if we need to add critical consciousness as a fourth goal, I'm all for it as one of the authors. But I don't think that it would be necessary right away, because in most of the dual language schools that we are serving in, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of just valuing one another. But I'm okay with it, and I'm ready to write the fourth edition.
Yeah. I'm looking in the chat box too. Another great book is Antibias Education for Young Children and Ourselves. They did come out with a new edition. It wasn't a lot of changes. So if you wanted to go with the older one, that is absolutely fine. Knowing that anti-bias and anti-racism are overlap significantly, but they're not the same. And that's how come we use that acronym ABAR for both. Oftentimes, anti-bias education heavily focuses on the interpersonal racism and the interpersonal relationship, and also then how you've internalized it. Like we were talking, Jose, about if like you've internalized anti-Blackness as a person of color, right? And then you, I don't want to say perform, but you express that. Where anti-racism specifically focuses on the institutional and systemic outcomes that we want to see. So essentially what I like, and my husband says it all the time, he's like, look, you don't have to like me, but you do need to do right by me. And I think that's kind of like this difference, where if there's a policy in place, if there's a structure in place that holds people accountable, regardless if they agree with you on an individual level or not, that's what anti-racism is looking for. And then someone else, I saw Juanita posted, we want to do more than survive, abolition teaching and the pursuit of educational freedom. I cannot recommend that book enough. That was actually the one I was looking for on my shelf. And I was like, oh, it might be downstairs. And then going back to math, I put it in the chat box. There's a website called radicalmath.org. And radicalmath.org has social justice lesson plans. And so it examples of social justice math topics that you can talk about is like racial profiling, the death penalty, prisons, poverty. You can talk about credit scores, managing debt. You can talk about, they have like ethno-mathematics, which is the study and celebration of mathematical practices from different countries and cultures. You can think about in my classroom for geometry, for instance, when I would teach them, because in Montessori we explicitly teach geometry in elementary. And one of the Montessori practices is we always show them the real or the big picture before we break it down. So it's a kind of a different teaching paradigm. And so I had photos of different Black girls and the way their hair was braided. Because oftentimes, if you ever look at braids, the parts are symmetrical. So again, it's like another way in which you're affirming identity. You are gathering language for them, because the girls will say like, oh my gosh, and the parts have to be perfect. Like that's what takes my mom so long to do my hair. And you can look at the concentric circles of the braids, or if they're in triangle parts or whatever it is. So hopefully that gives you enough to go on. And then Miss Adam Teaches on Instagram. She does a lot. Antonia does a lot with math equity. And the last 2 years, she's presented at the National Math Conference as well.
Britt, we have a couple of minutes left. Would you mind just really quickly touching upon the 4 parts of the framework? You don't have to go into detail, but they really connect with the testimonio framework that many of us use in dual language.
Yeah. So there's 2 different frameworks. There's one framework for anti-bias education. That framework was developed by Louise Thurman Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards. And I always say that because people erase them from their work. But the 4 goals of that framework, the first goal is self-love. We want children to feel pride about themselves, their family, their culture. The second goal of the framework is that we want children to embrace differences and have accurate language to describe differences. The third goal is that we want children to be able to identify unfairness and know that unfairness and bias hurts. And then the fourth goal is going to be, we want children to be able to advocate for themselves and for their neighbors, either individually or collectively. And so in anti-bias education, what's really important to note is we spend the bulk of our time on the first 2 goals, allowing children to feel good, affirmed in their identities, and embracing differences.
And to make the connection for dual language, for those of you that have been through the C6 Biliteracy Framework training, which is that lesson planning through an equity and social justice lens, remember that our 4 reflection questions align with what Britt just said. It's who am I? Who am I not? What do I believe in? And what do I need to do as I serve others? And so they are really, really aligned with the testimonio framework. As an FYI, Brit, just so that you know, I use those 4 reflection questions when I'm about to stick my foot in my mouth. And so as something's going to happen, like I'm like, who are you? Who are you not? What do you believe in? What do you need to do? ¿Quién eres? ¿Quién no eres? ¿Qué crees que tienes que hacer? ¿Quién eres? ¿Quién no eres? ¿Qué crees que tienes que hacer? And we teach that to kids so that as they are engaging in conflict or difficult situations, they're able to ask themselves those 4 testimonio reflection questions as well.
Wow. I feel like that goes really well too with the pyramid of accountability with how to be an ally, because then you'll know your lane, right? Like that's how you know, like, who am I? Who am I not? Is this my lane? Is it not my lane? And then you'll know how much space do I take up or how much space do I make, right? Yeah. Like that goes really, really well.
I'm so excited. Britt, thank you so much for joining us. Like, I just cannot even believe that you're here with us. To me, this is like a dream that we in Dual Language get a chance to like hang out with you. And just, I wish we're in the same space so that we can breathe your same air, right? So
and I can hug you.
Yes. So thank you so much. Where can people find you, Britt?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram. I'll be really honest. Instagram for me is kind of lifestyle. So you're gonna get a lot of coffee, a lot of my children, a lot of my thoughts and rants. If you wanted to actually work with me more, then I encourage you to join my Patreon. It's www.patreon.com/Britt Hawthorne. And there I have a community of over 1,000 educators that we are working together and becoming anti-bias, anti-racist. And then, I mean, like Jose, I do in-person workshops, but right now they're becoming virtual, and you can learn more at britthawthorne.com.
Thank you so much. If you'll join me in giving Britt Hawthorne un aplauso, un aplauso. Dígate un aplauso, ándale.
And give yourself, too, for being here, for showing up.
Amazing.
Just so that you know. So that
Gracias,
you
Brittany. Bravo, gracias.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gracias,
Seattle.
Just before you log off.
Gracias, Britt.
Thank you so much.
Viva Britt.
Before you all log out, I did want to share with you. So I've already received some information, and some of you contacted me. Is there going to be more, Jose? Are there going to be more people coming? And so Britt has connected me with somebody out of Texas that I am going to, that I've been in touch with. Additionally, Britt, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And then additionally, next Friday at 4 p.m., we're going to have our second in this series that Britt and I just made up. And so next week at 4 p.m., we're going to have Mayra Cruz. Oh. Mayra Cruz, she's going to be the next one because I still haven't solidified the plans with Lorena. But next week it's Mayra Cruz. She is the principal at a dual language school, Oyster Adams, and they have been doing anti-bias, anti-racism work through the sociocultural competence, critical consciousness lens. And so that way we can also begin our journey in terms of what does it look like in the classroom, because that's important as well. So we will see you next Friday at 4 p.m. for parte dos. We didn't know there was going to be a parte dos, Britt, and then parte tres. I'm hopeful that it's going to be with our colleague that you connected me with.
I hope so too. She's a powerhouse and just incredible. So thank y'all. Thank y'all so much for being here and showing up and sharing space.
Thank you. It'll be uploaded this weekend on YouTube. Just do youtube.com/Dr. Jose Medina. All right. Adios, everybody. I love you, Britt. Not in a weird way.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Adios. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Awesome.
Freedom time.
Muchas gracias.
Very loving, Britt. Dual language.
Gracias. Gracias.
Bravo. Bravo, gracias. Bravo, buen trabajo, gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
Excelente.
Favorites.
Thank you.
Los adoro. Adiós.
Gracias por todo, doctor.